Hello everyone, this is My Two Cents, and today I would like to talk about logical fallacies. Specifically, I would like to talk about the No True Scotsman Fallacy, what it is, and as the title of this video would suggest, I would like to talk about why I think Marxism, communism, socialism, the ideologies that fall under those banners are the ultimate example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. Before beginning, I would like to quick thank Shane Killian. He has recently posted a video critiquing comments made by Marxist Professor Richard Wolff. In that video, which is high quality, I'll link it in the description. I think everyone should go check it out. But that video is what really put this into my mind. So, what is the No True Scotsman Fallacy? Well, I'm going to take my cue here from yourlogicalfallacyis.com. If you check that out, I'll have the link in the description. They have a poster that has definitions for a lot of logical fallacies. I might slightly tweak some of their definitions, but I think for the most part, especially in the case of the No True Scotsman, this definition will do. So the No True Scotsman Fallacy. In this form of faulty reasoning, one's belief is rendered unfalsifiable because no matter how compelling the evidence is, one simply shifts the goalpost so that it wouldn't apply to the supposedly true example. This kind of post-rationalization is a way of avoiding valid criticisms of one's argument. Example: Angus declares that Scotsmen do not put sugar on their porridge, to which Lachlan points out that he is a Scotsman and puts sugar on his porridge. Furious, like a true Scot, Angus yells that no true Scotsman sugars his porridge. Okay, so it's not too difficult to understand. Basically, the No True Scotsman Fallacy is when someone tries to argue that all of a certain group are a certain way. Someone else provides a counterexample that clearly shows that all of that group are not that certain way, and the person then attempts to save the argument by discounting the counterexample by saying that's not a true example. Now, there are cases where I think saying that an opponent's counterexample is not a true example would in fact be appropriate. The No True Scotsman Fallacy is not always in play. So first, let's talk about an example where the No True Scotsman Fallacy is not in play. Picture an imaginary discussion between two people named Bob and Jim. They are discussing the issue of atheism and theism. And I know that can in some cases be a very complex discussion, but simply limit it to discussing atheism, which for purposes of this discussion we will simply define as someone who holds that God does not exist, and theism as someone who holds that God exists. Now, I know for people who have actually been involved in that discussion, there's actually a lot more to it, but that's not necessary for the point I'm trying to make. So Bob and Jim are having a talk, and let's suppose Bob says to Jim that he is an atheist. Jim then says, I am also an atheist. But Jim has a qualifier. He says, I am an atheist, but I hold that God exists. Now, I think Bob is going to say to Jim, wait a minute, if you hold that God exists, then you are not an atheist. And then imagine Jim were to say, well, that's the No True Scotsman Fallacy. Well, I think it's immediately apparent that no, it is not the No True Scotsman Fallacy. In this case, an atheist is a person who believes that God does not exist. Therefore, if Jim is going to claim that he is an atheist, but he believes God exists, well, clearly, based on the definition of an atheist, then Jim is not an atheist. This is not an example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. But having established that, let's quick go back to the example that was initially given, the one with Angus and Lachlan, and the claim that all true Scotsmen do not put sugar on their porridge. Now, in this case, Angus could try to say, well, if we properly define Scotsman as someone who is both from Scotland and someone who does not put sugar on their porridge, then this would not be an example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. And I think that would be true if you could demonstrate that somehow the definition of a Scotsman ought to necessarily include not putting sugar on your porridge. If Angus were prepared to demonstrate that this is a relevant distinction when it comes to being a Scotsman, then this would not be the example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. But if Scotsman just means someone from Scotland, which seems to me to be a very adequate definition, and there is no reason to think that all true Scotsmen must, for some reason, put sugar on their porridge, then obviously this is an example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. Now, I think many times in discussions like this, what is often lost is how relevant definition is to these kinds of discussions. Because obviously, there might be times, like the example about atheism and theism, where the definition is absolutely relevant, and therefore the No True Scotsman Fallacy is not in play. In other cases, like the simple one about Scotsmen and not putting sugar on their porridge, obviously that second part is in no way relevant to whether or not someone is from Scotland, and therefore it is absolutely an example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. So I think oftentimes, if someone is going to accuse someone else of using the No True Scotsman Fallacy, one thing you have to be clear on is what definition are we working with, and can the person who's using that definition demonstrate that his definition is accurate. But I think the No True Scotsman Fallacy is most forcefully shown in examples where, given the definition someone is using, they quite literally can't point to a true example. And that's why I think Marxism/socialism/communism turns out to be the ultimate example of this fallacy. Now, I just want to say that Marxism, socialism, communism, I know those three things are not all exactly the same. I know people who consider themselves to be socialists. Within that camp, there are a lot of different views. But I think the common elements between the three all end up making Marxism an example, a perfect example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. So quickly, what is Marxism? Now, I'd say it's beyond the scope of this video to go into an in-depth explanation of that, but if I had to pick simply the bare-bones element of Marxism, or at least the bare-bones elements that I believe most socialists who argue for it would advocate today, Marx essentially said that capitalism was this great evil, that in capitalism, inevitably, a few people would get very, very rich, everyone else would get perpetually poorer and poorer as the few rich oppressed them. And inevitably, this would lead to some kind of revolution in which the poor overthrew the rich and brought in the next stage in which they would set up a temporary dictatorship that was socialist. For Marx, socialism was merely a stepping stone to communism. However long this transition period took, the dictatorship would institute socialism, and then eventually the state would fade away, and we would be left with this stateless, classless, utopian society in which there is no private property, everything is owned by the community, and everything is perfect. Now, undoubtedly, if there are any Marxists watching this video, some of them are probably jumping up and down claiming that I have misrepresented Marxism. And if you think that, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment section explaining why you think I have misrepresented Marxism. But I don't think I have. I think those bare-bones explanation adequately sums up where Marxist, if at the very least that shows where Marxist thinking was going. What he thought would happen to capitalist countries, they'd inevitably at some point become socialist, and inevitably after that they become communist, a sort of social evolution, if you will. Well, one would think then, if Marx's theories were correct, then in the Soviet Union, in Mao's China, today in Venezuela, in North Korea, basically any country that has embraced socialism should in fact follow the pattern that Marx was talking about. But Marxism has had a 100% failure. Now, when you're having discussions with socialists and you point out the collapse of the Soviet Union, what happened in Mao's China, what's happening in Venezuela today, the most common rejoinder is, of course, that's not real socialism. That's not true communism. That's not true Marxism. Well, you see where I'm going, why I think this turns out to be the ultimate example of the No True Scotsman Fallacy. But the question is, can they point, if they're going to say all these things are not true examples, well, can they point to a true example? Well, to illustrate that I think they can't, Fox News recently did an interview with known Marxist professor Richard Wolff, in which he was asked, what is the closest country today, the country that most closely resembles the socialist utopia for which he would advocate. Let's take a look at that clip now.
Is it justified? No, you're explaining it.
Which country in the world is closest to your socialist paradise?
I don't think any of them are.
Which is closest?
I don't think any of them can be ranked like that. It makes no sense to me. Socialism is a change out of capitalism.
So when one of the leading advocates of Marxism is asked what country is closest to the socialist utopia he envisions today, he's unable to provide a single example. And I know in many a conversation I have had with people who advocate socialism, when I try to talk about socialist countries, the Soviet Union, well, reference what's happening in Venezuela right now, the immediate rejoinder is always, that's not real socialism, that's not real communism, that's not real Marxism. Well, if Marxism really is the way to go, if it really describes the way reality works, why is it that they can't point to a single true example? Well, because it's the No True Scotsman Fallacy. Reality bears out that Marx was wrong. Socialism does not inevitably lead to this utopia. It inevitably leads to collapse and destruction. And if you're going to claim as a definition that all societies that embrace socialism thrive, well, then you're employing what I will from here on out call the No True Marxist Fallacy, because such a society simply does not exist in reality. That's my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, minds.com, or VidMe, check out the links in the description.